Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. Over this series and last, we've been talking to human rights academics and practitioners about research, impact, and advocacy in the struggle for human rights. I'm Todd Landman. In today's episode of the Rights Track, we're discussing the question of ecocide, or the application of international law to the destruction of the environment. My guest is Garth Lenz, activist, photographer, and advocate for the environment. Garth has done amazing photographs of the cost of industrialization in environmental terms. His TED Talk has more than 780,000 views, and his work is featured in Time, New York Times, and the BBC Wildlife magazine. He has also addressed major corporations and government bodies on issues of conservation and sustainability. He's one of only 60 photographers to be made a Fellow of the International League of Conservation. So welcome, Garth. It's great to have you here on this episode of the Rights Track.
Thank you so much, Todd. It's wonderful to be here.
So the last time we spoke, I believe you were over in the UK at an event about ecocide, this concept that you can use the sort of international laws as we apply to concepts like genocide, crimes against humanity, etc., and stretch the legal argument a bit to include environmental destruction, that it's actually illegal to destroy the environment. And I think that's the sort of campaign that's out there. But when we look at your work, you've actually spent a lot of time taking extraordinary, high-definition, very large photographs of the consequences of oil exploration, for example, the Tar Sands Development in Canada and other industrialization projects. So I guess I want to start by asking you why you chose photography as the medium for sort of the storytelling you're doing and the advocacy that you are engaged in.
Well, I think, we live in a highly visual society. Images cut through barriers of language, and I think that the power of the still image in particular can really change the way people think about these issues. And I always mention this ad I saw a number of years ago, I think on the back of National Geographic or something, where there were 4 yellow sort of empty frames, and it was an ad for Nikon cameras, because Nikon sort of uses the yellow color like Nat Geo does. Under each of them, it had a brief sentence describing the image that might be in that yellow frame. And these were images that, pretty much any of us could call to mind. A young girl runs down a roadway. A soul man, holds up a line of tanks. These images have become to symbolize these subjects, injustices, war, and been huge motivators, I think, for the public to demand the kind of change that we all want to see. So I think photography, especially here where I am based in Canada, although I travel widely, the industrial sacrifice zones are so vast and so visceral and so visual that photography seems just such an effective way to communicate that to a broad audience.
I want to pick up on this notion of vastness, because one thing you do, or two things you do actually in your photography. One is to compare and contrast. So you show these extraordinary forest scenes of the multitude of colors and the leaves changing and all these wonderful natural birch trees and other trees, maple, etc., typical of the Canadian landscape. And then you juxtapose that with the Tar Sands development, where an entire layer of the Earth's surface has been stripped away to access the petroleum product. So that's the one thing, the sort of compare and contrast work that you do, but equally the sense of vastness and scale. And I remember you showed us a picture of these dump trucks, earth-moving dump trucks, which if you look at them, they look like a little Tonka trucks, down on a children's playground. But you described them as each back of each truck could have one or more houses in the back of it. And then you see 100 of these trucks lined up. And that gives you a sense of the scale of the excavation that's taking place. I wonder if you could comment on how you try to communicate that.
Well, exactly, Todd. I mean, you try to find some point of reference, and the thing is, in some of these, mega industrial sites, everything is so outsized that, for instance, those trucks, you need to kind of do the math, and with the dimensions of 52 by 35 by 25, 52 feet long by 35 feet wide by about 25 feet tall, you could build a 3,000 square foot 2-story large home within those parameters. And so to juxtapose that and get people to think, okay, well, stop thinking about that as a truck, think of that as a 3,000 square foot home and start lining those up and start thinking about, is this a subdivision? Is this a town? How huge an area is actually being turned into industrial site where once was this biologically diverse ecosystem that supported a huge range of species, not least importantly by a long shot, humans, which comes back to, of course, the human rights connection and what we're all losing as a result of these massive, massive projects, which, most of us don't really feel we have any control over.
So there's a real tension here, a number of tensions with the human rights arguments. One would be there's this notion that there's a human right to development, and some would say, well, if you have a human right to development, then you need to excavate, explore, dig, pull things out of the ground in order for people to have economic prosperity and to enjoy the fruits of development. Then there's the whole debate around sustainable development and how you can have development processes that kind of minimize future impacts of industrialization, etc. So that's one set of tensions, and I guess the other set of tensions is this idea that if human rights is grounded in a set of philosophies, and there's no real agreement on which philosophy. There's a lot of contestation around where human rights are based in philosophy. But if there is a presumption that the human being isn't somehow has primacy over the natural world, then it does create some problems for the work that you do, unless you can link it back to human sustenance, human life, etc.
I'm not sure that there is that much of a tension between the needs of biodiversity, the needs of wildlife, the needs of the natural world, and the needs of humans. I mean, you tend to have healthy communities when you have healthy ecosystems, healthy plant communities, healthy human communities. They require the same, at the most fundamental level, the same basic needs, air, water, sunlight, opportunity, habitat. You don't find too many, if you dig a little deeply, you don't find too many extremely healthy, sustainable, highly functioning human communities surrounded by abject devastation. You may find people within those communities, some of whom are doing extremely well. But if you look at the whole cross-section, I just spent time working on a project on the Texas Gulf Coast down around Houston and Port Arthur. And yes, you have amazing Fortune 500 companies there. You also have some of the highest rates of unemployment and poverty and health diseases in these communities that are the only place they can afford to live is right around all of these massive refineries and fossil fuel infrastructure, and are breathing all the fumes and the carcinogenic gases and so on that emit from these facilities. So, what's really good if you have a long-term vision, I think, and if you're looking at the whole community, what's good for human communities and what's good for biodiversity in the natural world, generally is the same thing, I think, in the long term.
So I like this argument that we are part of the ecosystem and not separate from it, and I think that's an important distinction. But you raised something in your example from Texas that's intriguing, in that you talked about where people live, but not only where they live, but where they can afford to live. So there's a linkage between massive scaled industrialization projects, income and wealth inequalities, and the availability of work as well as wages and family incomes to support a house value, if you will, and that marginalized people, social, economic marginalized people, find themselves near these sites where there'll be knock-on effects of the industrialization process. So not only are they poor and marginalized and can't afford to live in places away from those sites, but at the same time there may be deleterious effects on their health by being located near those sites at the same time. So there's a certain interdependency, if you will, between processes of industrialization at scale, social inequalities, and health outcomes.
Very much so. And oftentimes many of us in relatively privileged situations and in terms of employment and so on think, well, you can just pack up and move. Well, it's not so easy for a lot of these people, and a lot of these people didn't start in poverty. A lot of people had that poverty imposed on them, and also just recently, I've been doing work on this project through an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Environmental Integrity Project, and this is called the human cost of fossil fuel development, and was looking at shale gas development in Marcellus Shale and around in Pennsylvania last spring. And I've been to Marcellus Shale a number of times now, and many of these people signed off subsurface rights for shale gas development, and then find that their water is polluted and their farm, their home that they've put all of their money into, that's their nest egg, is now not worth the value that it should be, and they're trapped. They can't go anywhere. Their farm's worth nothing. Their water's polluted. They have health concerns. Their kids might be getting sick, and so I think that there's such a tie-in between environmental degradation and community degradation. Oftentimes the problem is that until those problems get so widespread, and we're starting to see that in British Columbia this summer, until those problems get so widespread that it's actually affecting the power brokers, the people of privilege, or their children, it seems that the urge of denial, the desire not to have to change things, not to have to make any sort of changes that might in any way threaten that privileged position, is so strong that no change happens until those very rich sectors, very privileged sectors, really start to feel the pain. And by that time, perhaps it's too late.
Yeah, and so the case of Pennsylvania is an interesting one, partly because it's my home state. I grew up near Harrisburg, but the shale gas you referred to,
okay.
yeah, the shale gas is is extracted through a fracking process, right? So this is this high pressure water that's hot, as I understand, underground, that releases the shale product that is then refined for fuel consumption. Is that right?
Exactly, and obviously there's been a lot of talk about this in the UK as well, and we really are playing with fire here. We don't really know what can happen. There's been earthquakes in non-earthquake zones that we're finding. I mean, a few years ago, one actually rumbled through Washington. We've seen them up in northeastern BC, where there's a lot of fracking, which never had earthquakes there before. We don't know what it's doing to the water table. And the problem with shale gas, of course, is that it's so widely deposited throughout the planet that it's sort of everywhere. And then coming back to my province of British Columbia, I took my two young children, one who suffers from asthma, to go for a camping trip on the other side of the province near Alberta, and the whole way through, because of the massive wildfires that have been burning out of control in British Columbia and causing evacuations of whole towns, because of those wildfires that have been burning now for over a month, we were in a pall of smoke and particulate matter all the way back. And I started thinking, well, what if my daughter has an asthma attack? What do we do? Where do we go? The whole province is like this, and it's happening across the borders. So it's pretty crazy when you think, and I can't even get away from this, and my child has asthma. And as a parent, that just puts you in an extremely vulnerable and kind of helpless situation. When I was a kid, I don't think I would have been able to believe that things would get so bad that we were scared to breathe the air, scared to drink the water, scared to go out in the sun for prolonged periods of time and not take action as a society.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of the policy responses that are emerging now are fascinating. The French they want to ban all fossil fuel cars by 2040. The British have done the same. This is important, no new petrol and diesel cars by 2040. People are gradually shifting their preferences to hybrid vehicles, etc. But I always wonder, does it displace the problem in the sense that if you outlaw petrol and diesel cars, I'm quite happy to drive an electric car or public transport or some other mode of transport. But where does the energy come from to generate the electricity? And that there's no real answer to that question, because we would have to really, really generate a lot of electricity for all the cars to be powered. And it's not clear that would be through renewables, through wind farms, through solar, or we go right back to nuke. And we have this gigantic nuclear power plant in Hinkley Point that's being developed. There's another one in Bradwell in Essex that's going to be developed. And so there's a whole range of issues connected to how we get power and change our lifestyles accordingly. And again, all the same contradictions that you've raised through your work are then salient, but in a different way.
Yes, and obviously it's a huge problem. And I guess in response to your opening sentence listing all the different ways we could get power, it's going to have to be all of the above. But I think we have to start making that change, and the news out of Europe is so encouraging. Of course, here in Canada, we're being bombarded with all of this news south of the border. Even in our own country, I have some encouragement with the new government, but we're still so far behind what folks are doing in Europe. So, what I hear from you gives me a lot of hope. But on the subject of where we get that energy, and then, obviously with electric cars, I mean, I don't think that's the one answer. I don't think there is any one answer. I mean, obviously part of the problem with electric cars is that, a lot of people simply can't afford them. But the fact that, once I think, again, with, ruling out the production of fossil fuel cars at a certain point in time, like France is talking about, obviously this is going to bring the price of those vehicles down. They're already coming down. And of course, some of the earlier models will start to appear on the used market. But in terms of where we get the energy for that, I mean, I've always kind of thought, okay, you'll have your electric Prius or Volt or something in California or someplace like that, which has a lot of coal-powered generating stations, then you're plugging yourself into a coal-powered generating station. But I was listening to a documentary just recently, and even if you do that, even if you plug your electrical car into the most greenhouse gas intensive form of electrical energy you could get, which would be a coal-fired electrical generating station, you're still having a huge reduction in greenhouse gases versus driving a conventional car, simply because you're losing all of the greenhouse gas emissions that you get from actually driving that car. And of course, the fossil fuel that you put in your car, you're also having to pay for the greenhouse gas emissions of extracting and producing that fossil fuel. So even a non-perfect solution, such as plugging our renewable energy-based vehicles into non-renewable-based power generating stations, is still a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah, there's still a net benefit there, and I think that's really important because it is that step in the right direction. So I wonder if we could maybe finish our discussion around the future. So President Trump and his administration have signaled that they don't want to be part of the Paris climate deal. It's not clear whether the United States can just walk away from that deal or not. And of course, at the G20 meeting, a lot of world leaders were sort of raising their eyebrows at the whole issue and of course want to soldier on with the Paris climate deal nonetheless. But, and you talked about there's maybe a little bit more hope in Europe than in North America at the moment. But what motivates you in terms of continuing to do your work? Do you feel that there are incremental gains that are happening, that things are moving in the right direction, and that you feel motivated each day to get up and continue your work as a photographer? Well,
as I always say, I have 2 young children, so I don't have the luxury of pessimism. I don't have the luxury of apathy. I feel a primary responsibility as a parent, just a member of society, to do what I can to try to make some positive changes. So, in a way, I think it's good that, given the fact that the Paris Climate Accord, they're non-binding targets, and given that whether the Trump administration signed on or didn't sign on, they would probably just conduct themselves exactly the same way. I think it's probably good that they didn't sign on in a way, because it just puts into more and more clear focus the fact that the rest of us have got to make up for the complete loss of leadership on so many levels in the United States. And that agenda is not being moved in many cases by federal regulations. It's being moved on the provincial or the state or the county or the city level, that those governments are the ones that are saying, well, okay, you do what you want in Washington, D.C. or Ottawa or London, we're going to get on with it and do what we think is right for our communities and our human rights and the future of the planet. And that, I think, is a very encouraging sign.
That's great, Garth. I really appreciate you fleshing out some of these connections for us today. And I'd urge our listeners to go see the TED Talk that you gave a number of years ago. It's really gripping and quite an emotional talk. The visuals are absolutely captivating, and I love the way you've connected the large narratives you're telling through photography to the human suffering and this notion that we're all part of the same ecosystem. And I think now more than ever, this issue has come to the fore precisely because of the developments over the last year. And it's just great to have someone as knowledgeable and as active as yourself to join us today. So on behalf of the Rights Track, thank you very much for being on this episode.
Well, thank you very much, Todd. It's been a real treat and a privilege.
This episode of The Rights Track was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. Series 2 of the podcast is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. More information, including all the podcast episodes from Series 1 and accompanying show notes for each of our interviews, is available on our website at www.rightstrack.org.